Hello there, boys and girls. It is Patrick here, Egg Not Poker. New video today, and we're going to be focusing on theory today. So we're going to be focusing on player profiling. So player profiling, in a nutshell, is where we're basically identifying different types of player, whether they're aggressive players, looser players, passive players, etc. How to profile them, how to categorize them, how to add and present notes on them, and then how to also just basically adjust our play depending on the type of profile that we've selected for our villains. So just very quickly before we begin, as always, thank you so much to everyone who's been liking, subscribing and supporting the channel overall. Excuse me, we are now up to over 500 subscribers, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm really happy in such a short space of time to have accumulated so many acolytes into the fold, into my cult. I'm very happy. And as always, please like, please comment, please subscribe, all the normal jargon and gist. So that said and out of the way, player profiling then. So what is player profiling, first of all? So player profiling is basically when you're playing a game and you're saying, right, you've got your strategy overall that you want to implement into the game. You know roughly what you're doing and how you're doing it. But you come across certain different types of opponents. So you get more aggressive opponents, tighter opponents, etc. And that may allow you to potentially deviate in certain different types of ways in the way that your strategy sort of flows. For example, you're against tighter opponents. You may be able to sort of bully them more, or you may have to fold more, for example. And again, against more aggressive opponents, we may have to be prepared to potentially buckle up and cool down, or face some more aggression, both pre and post against them. So we're going to have to look at how to mix up our overall strategy against them. So what we're going to be doing in this little document here is we're going to be looking at how to profile villains by color coding them, adding notes, marking them, what to look for, and also how to sort of identify villains, how to categorize them, and a good way of using that information and how to use that information and put it in clearly for in-game real-time use. So real-time assistance, things like botting or using pieces of software that charts or mini solver database or whatever during action is obviously a complete no-no. However, the type of RTA that you can use, which is completely legal, is just that of the mind and notes. So for example, you can literally tell yourself, this is the type of opponent I'm playing against. I can color code that guy. I've played previous hand histories with this guy. I can make notes on him, And also, if you're able to do so on the particular site that you play on, you'll also have HUD stat information as well. So those types of real-time assistance are absolutely crucial in identifying, or not only identifying, but also just adjusting your strategy depending on the villain profile that you've identified and selected to play against. So to begin with then, exploit adjustments versus specific player types and adjustments with appropriate notes. So as we said, we need to try and identify the opponent, take notes of them, use the HUD information, and with those three combinations we can then move forward with our thought processes when applying our strategies. So let's have a look at the first option then, number one. So what we want to begin with in our strategy here with player profiling is we want to profile your villain into an appropriate category, which would usually come under things like, there will be other ones which we'll look at a little bit later, but the primary ones that you want to be looking at in terms of profiles is a recreational or a fun or a fishier type of player. Someone who looks like they're playing, I'm not going to say that people don't take the game seriously, right? But they look like they're either just sort of messing about, they're having a laugh, they're having fun, they're doing weird and wacky things that don't really make any sense. They're just kind of doing stuff. Telltale signs are like they're short stack, for example, like sub 100 big blinds. Maybe they're sort of cold calling in the hijack. Maybe they're cold calling to 3 bets or 4 bets in some scenarios. Maybe they're just doing weird plays. Maybe they're just sort of cooling down with really silly hands or silly bluffs, weird things. But generally a recreational player is someone that's going to be playing not necessarily more hands. Like, they can be aggressive or tight, but someone, for example, who may just look at like ace-6 offsuit under the gun and just feel like that's a good hand because it has an ace in it, for example. Whereas like a regular player would be someone, even if they're a good or a bad regular, might be a player that might be playing not potentially just strategically, but a bit more sort of straightforward in a way that makes more sense in terms of the way the game's flowing, like they're opening a bit more the bit better hands. Maybe they're just playing in a bit more of a normal sort of ABC fashion. So you've got your recreational player, you've got your regular player, as we said, and then you've got your more sort of whaley player. So you've got like someone who's sort of playing way too many hands, whether they're really, really aggressive, whether they're really, really tight. You've all known those types of players. You get the people who don't play hardly at all, or, the old boy coffees or the nits, and then you also get your whaley type of players as well, and then you get your absolute maniacs, which are on the more like aggressive spectrum of the whales. So what we're saying is, when you're identifying these types of opponents, you want to color code them. I mean, this isn't exactly revolutionary. I think it's been going on since the dawn of time with online poker, and to some degree live poker as well with the mental notes. It's just sort of creating a profile for your opponents and putting them into categories. So that's where I call it just player profiling. Identifying the opponent type, putting them into a category, and then being able to, in real time, try and dissect pieces of information you've previously assumed with your HUD stats, with your notes, with your color coding. That will just give you very quick pieces of information as you're going along, which is very, very useful. So the question I think that would come naturally with this is, how would you identify players as being whaley players? How would you identify someone as a regular, as a nit, as an aggro, tard, as a general recreational, however you want to say it? So like I said previously, in terms of finding a recreational player, it's to do with the stack depths, like less than 100 bigs. As we said, maybe they're doing some weird and wonderful things. Maybe they're sort of cold calling 3-bets, 4-bets in out of position. Maybe they're just sort of opening weird hands that don't really make much sense. Those are your general telltale signs. People who perhaps call too wide, like ridiculously wide, or open really, really wide and then play weird post-flop. They're some of the telltale signs of a recreational player. A regular player, again, as we said, is someone who's, whether they're good or bad, is going to open a bit more of an ABC range. You're going to play a little bit more of an ABC fashion. You may or may not be able to, depending on what type of regular they are, you might be able to bluff them more. You may have to fold to them more often. You may have to give them more credit, or maybe you have to actually give them less credit if they're a very aggressive regular, for example. But you can play a little bit more of a strategic game one way or another against a regular player most of the time, whereas a recreational player is someone you're looking to sort of deviate and play mainly exploitative against. And then finally, in terms of a whale, again, it's just someone this is mainly your HUD stats, I suppose, but it's like you're going to have people who are just playing a lot of hands. They're playing like sort of 30, 40, 50% hands, whether they're raising or just V-pipping hands, whatever. They're just involved a lot of the time. They're making very crazy cooldowns, very crazy weird bluffs, etc. They're just in there, aren't they? Like those are the types of whales that you might identify. So, secondly then, when you've color-coded your villain. So you've identified a recreational, a reg, a whale, whoever it is. What we want to do then is we want to, so once you categorize them, we need to color code them, don't we? So you want to have, there's no right or wrong with this. You choose what you prefer, but you would color code your villains based off of their profile that you've selected. So for example, if you've got a regular opponent, or let's say a recreational opponent to begin with, you would mark them. I mark a recreational player as green. It's just what I do. But then, for example, there might be a slightly different type of recreational player. So you might just have a standard recreational player who's identified as a weaker player, as a recreational player. They call really, really wide. They play loads of hands, but they're not very aggressive. So they're more of like they're more like a looser. It's a bit of a mix, I suppose, but you can get like loose passive, loose aggressive, tight aggressive types of like regular players, types of recreational players, types of whales. So what you can do is I tend to have, personally, I have recreational as green, and then if I have like a tight, like a more of a passive recreational, then I'll color code that slightly like a lighter green. If I have a slightly more aggressive, I've identified the person as a fish, but they're quite aggressive. They're not really a regular player. They don't really play any kind of proper ranges or anything. They're just a bit aggressive, like an aggressive weaker player. Then I would mark that like a darker green. So I've got the green and then the different shades of green. Like against regulars, I tend to just have separate colors. So for example, like a tight reg, or like a tight aggressive, a tag, is more just like a regular blue for me. Something like down here, for example, like this sort of standard blue color is more like a tight aggressive, a taggier player. Whereas I've got my recreational here in green. Red is more like a loose aggressive opponent. Purple's more of a whaley type of opponent. So again, there is a slight difference in these two. We'll talk about it more in depth later. And there are a few other ones as well. But what we're saying is you basically need to start having different color shades based on the different type of profiles that you've got marked. So again, some of those examples in terms of HUD stats, you might have like a tight passive recreational or regular player. So these are examples. These aren't like set in stone. These are just examples for HUD stats for people to take a look at. 16% is the VPIP. The number one stat will be VPIP, voluntary hands played. The second stat will be PFR, how many percentage of hands they're raising overall, and then the third one will be, it won't be aggression factor, it will be 3-bet percentage. Okay, so that's what the three stats are. Like a tight passive player in general, like they don't play a massive VPIP. It massively varies, but it's you're generally looking for the passive players that they're more limp calling or waiting for very strong hands to raise with, and not 3-betting as much. Whereas a tight aggressive opponent, they may still not play that many hands, but when they do play them, as you can see, we've gone from 8 to 14 with the PFR. They're actually sort of waiting for good hands, but then they are playing them aggressively, for example, and then they don't tend to have a very large 3-bet percentage, and they tend to play more of a nuttier range. Again, it varies. You can't have a specific number. A loose aggressive regular or recreational player, again, generally loose aggressive, whether it's a good or a bad opponent, it tends to be it's similar to a whale, but just like downsized. So for example, like a whale is more like 30, 35, 40%, whereas like a loose aggressive can be anywhere from like 25 to 30% or 25 to 28%. What I'm getting at, you're not going to have specific numbers, but just these are the different types of HUD stats pre-flop that you can look at when you start gaining information that are going to help you start to identify what type of player profile you want to place that person under. So there might be, you might identify them as a regular player, but then you also might say, well, they're actually quite a tight regular player. Perhaps not a nit, perhaps not a fish or a tight fish, so I might mark them as a tag, a tight aggressive opponent. Whereas the next guy you might tag as a recreational, the next guy you might tag as a very, very strong regular. There are some extra ones that we'll look at the end. But these ones here, like tight passive, loose aggressive, passive whale, you can have like tight aggressive regular like tag, etc. Those are some of the main ones that you would use, and these are some of the examples of the HUD stats that you would use to identify them. So just some information here following that on. You will not only rely on pre-flop stats. Pre-flop information helps give an overall assessment, for example VPIP, PFR or 3-bet. However, there will also be a lot of valuable post-flop information that will also help you to not only profile your villain as a general assumption, but also to add concrete information to make reliable profiles. So what that means is basically, excuse me, burping everywhere. Like these pre-flop HUD stats are super important. So you may just say to yourself, I know that guy's a fish, so I'll tag him as a fish, a recreational, and then you move on a couple, 50 hands later, you play him again. But had you sort of specified based on the information that he may have actually been quite a tight fish or a tight recreational, however you want to say it. So knowing that you've got a tighter player behind, like a tighter or looser, for example, I have a loose recreational, right, or a whaley recreational player. Passive rec, whatever, those types of players are the people you want to make a lot of money against. So you want to identify and specify what type of recreational they may be, and that may also influence certain decision processes as you're going through the hand in real time. So some of the telltale things that we can look for that aren't just VPIP, PFR, and 3-bet. So obviously we've got the VPIP and RFI. RFI is just raise first in or PFR, however you want to say it. We've also got post-flop stats. So these are really important when you're trying to add a really sort of correct and accurate assessment of your player profile. So things like things to look at are things like fold to flop, fold to turn, fold to river c-bet. You might have villains, this is where we start to get a little bit more advanced, a bit more specific, but you might have like a tight aggressive opponent, or you might have like a regular opponent that you play against regularly. They don't really do anything too special, they're not really that hard to play against, but they don't really make massive mistakes either. They're just kind of like middle of the road ABC regular player. As you start to identify some of the issues that they may have, like they may be c-betting flop like 80 or 90%, but then folding, but then checking like 80, 90% on turns and folding when checking on turns and rivers, for example. So again, things to look out for, like you'll have tight aggressive opponent, but what you'll do is you'll then add a note. So you can add these extra little pieces of information, both pre and post, about the hands very briefly in those notes. So you can say, right, I've got a tight, aggressive opponent. I've got a note here. Let's have a look. Oh, okay, excellent. Villain overfolds to 3-bets. Okay, excellent. I'll look at his information. Ah, perfect. Yes, that's correct. You're identifying lots of different pieces of information quickly without having to sort of deep dive and take a lot of time. That's the idea behind profiling players. Not only just color coding them, but adding notes and looking at their HUD stat information. So other things like, for example, they may be 3-betting or folding to 3-bet a large amount of the time. So again, very, very important pieces of information to note when looking at making notes and color coding opponents. 4-betting, fold to 4-bet. How often they go to showdown and how often they win on showdown. So, for example, you might say like this, like in the future, you've been called down extremely light, like you 4th pair, 5th pair has called you down in the 3-bet pot and called you down the whole way. Yeah, board's ace, king, queen, 5, 7, and they've got pocket 4s and they've just stationed your ass down all the way down, 150 big blinds, 300 big blind pot, whatever. That's something you need to make a note of. That's extremely important. So you know you've got like a passive sort of calling station, quite loose, but not aggressive, recreational. So again, it's very important to start identifying which pieces of information you can identify and then use in real time for the next hands that you come across them against with. It's really, really important as time goes on to have these notes and information and correct color codes, because it's taking time away from your thought processes and allowing you to have more time for the real post-flop decisions, or pre-flop potentially. Other important things to look out for is maybe you've got quite a tight, aggressive opponent, but they don't, like for example, they don't check raise flop or turn or river very often, or maybe their c-betting tendencies say that they're not c-betting very often either. So you can start to look for more passivity in the type of profile that you're going to identify for your villain. It's interesting just to quickly say, because you might get villains, you might get a tight villain who just doesn't play many hands and plays them aggressively, so okay, that's a tag. But then they might get post-flop and be absolutely fucking mad. Like, you know, there will be some discrepancies. So you can't always, like, sort of guarantee you're going to have the right sort of piece of information on your opponent. But what you can do is just say, look, as a generalization, I know this guy plays quite a tight pre-flop range. I know he's quite aggressive with that range, so he's a tag. I then add the note and say that this guy plays certain way post-flop that might need to be noted, so then we can make post-flop adjustments from there. We get to that when we get to it, obviously, but it's just something to know and to think about in advance, which is quite important, to be honest. So disclaimer, disclaimer, there is no exact science with the HUD stats of villains, so good players may play badly and bad players may play well or improve over time. You might come across really, really good players who are just having a really shitty day or just not playing very well today in general, and you might go, that's a fish, that's a really terrible player. But actually, they're really good and very, very strong players. So be careful how you identify people. If you don't just assume someone's a certain type of player by playing one hand with the person. You know, if you've got a couple of hundred hands minimum on a person and you've got pieces of relevant information, then you can mark them correctly. Also, as an ego thing, do not profile people who outplay you as bad or weak players. When we come to this like entitlement or revenge tilt style thing, like we looked at with the mental game video, I can add a link in the description below regarding that previous video. That's quite interesting for anyone who might be interested in looking at the mental game. But is one thing I used to do, honestly, is I used to get angry with people who outplayed me, and I couldn't hack the fact that they outplayed me, or I played badly against them for whatever reason. So what I would do to make myself feel better, this is really stupid, but it's just going to be honest, is I used to mark them as weaker players just to make myself feel better, because I was mentally unstable and mentally weak. Really, really bad mental game. Really looked for revenge, really felt entitled, always felt unlucky, never felt like I got outplayed. So don't ever try and feel that way. You know, if you get outplayed and they play well, mark them and respect that opponent. And then just look to try and improve yourself to try and counter them later down the road. So like we said, a bad profiled opponent can cost you a lot of money if done incorrectly. So again, potentially your marks, your profiles may need to change over time, right? If you've got someone who's been playing badly for 6 months or a year or whatever, they may just get coaching. Maybe they start studying. Maybe they just realize that they've been making loads of mistakes. They've been looking at their play and done lots of adjustments and made the game a lot better. So you may have to adjust these notes as you go, right? You can't just keep the same player profiles, color codes and notes forever. You will need to adjust them as you go on, especially against the people that you may come across regularly in the stakes that you play. Moving on. So we want to be taking appropriate notes to go with the HUD information. We have mentioned that already. So what types of information, what types of notes can we look for? So notes are extremely important tools to use as brief pieces of relevant data that can be glanced at and dissected quickly for future spots. Examples of really good pieces of HUD data that will also assist you in looking for some of the notes that you might take is things like Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager. Is it Hold'em Manager 3? Or Hold'em Manager 2, I believe. I haven't ever used Hold'em Manager. I use Poker Tracker 4, but those are a couple of really good HUDs to use. But in terms of making notes, I haven't written it down, but I want to mention it very quickly before we do anything else. When we're talking about notes, we want them to be very RTA, real-time assistance based, which what I'm saying is we want to be focusing on something that you can hover over, look at the opponent and go, this is my note. What does the note say? It's got to be quick. It's got to be snappy. It's got to grasp your attention in a couple of seconds and not take all of your information and focus away from your hand. You must be able to just glance at it in a couple of seconds, identify the piece of information provided in front of you, and then move forward, rather than sit there and spend half an hour thinking about what the note means, trying to look through any spelling errors and going through 20 sentences of complete jargon and junk. So I've given you some examples of relatively good notes in my opinion. So let's have a look at some of them. So I might look at my opponent, have a look at the note provided, and it may say something like 4-bet folded, button versus big blind. Turnover bets are bluff heavy. Has protected checks on bad range textures. Maybe this opponent limp raises under the gun with aces. Cold 4-bets king jack off and stacks off pre. That's quite a good one to note. That was in one of the 2-0 hand reviews I did a couple of weeks ago. That was in there, the king jack off. So that is actually a thing. Calls down 4th pair to triple barrels, triple barrel river jam, excuse me. So we know that this opponent may call down extremely wide. Don't bluff this person, Jesus. Has a lot of flop c-bets and then weak turn checks. So again, that's a little bit, that is relative or relevant, sorry, but it's probably you probably need a little bit of data before that you put that one in, but it is relevant if you have the samples and the data for it, I believe. Doesn't bluff / gives up on rivers with valuable bluff / weakest combos. So that's, for example, you might say, look, I'm at 25 an L or 50 an L. I identified that person probably should have bluffed that combo. He's quite low in his range, or maybe he's got extremely good blockers that are relevant in terms of bluffing the river, but he didn't. He checked back and gave up. So that might be quite important to you when just thinking about potentially calling this person in it for a river shove in a similar scenario the next time around. So quite important, I would think, with that one. And then finally, flats kings pre to a single open. Again, also somewhat relevant depending on the stakes you play. If you're against utter nits or people who just completely soft play pre-flop, again, these are examples, aren't they? But they're, examples of the types of notes that you would make. Okay. So I've got an example of a really bad note. So this is probably quite interesting. So I've given an example of a bad note, a few coaching points, and a better example. So a bad note might be something like this. So imagine you're in a real-time hand. You hover over your note on the villain, and then it says this. So I think this guy bets a lot. I think this guy's betting a lot. It's not, again, I've just remembered I've actually made this bad English on purpose, because I think it's important to make sure you've got correct English grammar and you are spelling your words correctly so you can identify them properly when you're reading them back. I think this guy bets a lot. Lovely. That means nothing to me. He raised Queen of Spades, Jack of Clubs in first position and bet a large amount on the flop, which was a mixed board. What does a mixed board mean? I need more specific information than that. He bet the turn really big. Do we have a specific size? Did he overbet? Did he bet 3/4? What did he do? And continued to do so. And that's it. I didn't have any more information than that. There's nothing on the river, nothing at all. And then it goes on to say, maybe check min raise more and see what he does, ? This is awful, but this is actually, I've come across quite a lot of these bad notes in some of the reviews that I've looked at previously, not to the two guys that I've done, but there's a few ones I did a couple of months back for a few a few friends, is when looking at notes, you kind of just want very specific, precise pieces of information that you don't have to physically sit there and sift through. It's almost just like a very brief bullet point in as little words as possible. So this note is extremely large with a lot of vague and random unnecessary information. That's correct. That doesn't even have a conclusion. Yep, that's also true. A better example would have been. So this is just 3 pieces of information in bullet points now, instead of just one giant sort of fuck off sentence. Aggressive in early position, in brackets, queen jack off. Okay, fine. C-bets often and barrels most turns and rivers. Okay, that's fine. Another bullet point here underneath. Potentially over bluffs. All streets and river shoves are extremely bluff heavy. Okay, that's fine. That's very relevant, good information to know. And then finally, usually bet smaller with value. Excellent. Very simple, very precise, very specific. And we've just sort of squeezed this information into very, very small sort of bite-sized chunks where we can just look at them, identify the information, and use it appropriately in real time. Perfect. This second note is specific and precise. Although it does contain a lot of information, it is very clear and laid out well, so it is easy to read and use in real time. Legal RTA. That's what this is, and that's what we want. Perfect. So finally then, I don't want this video to be long. We'll be done in a couple of minutes. Additional/optional profiles. So if we hover back to the beginning, we looked at some of the biggest examples of player profiles are things like, you've got a regular, recreational, and a whale type of opponent, and then you would start specifying those like, aggressive whale, passive whale, tight aggressive regular, loose aggressive regular, etc., etc., etc. Excuse me. A couple of other interesting ones that you might want to add, things like this. So you've got potentially a weaker regular. So I don't have that here, but I actually have a purple, like a darker purple tag, because I just have like loose passive whale and aggressive whale, but just like a kind of mauve purpley type of color that I use. That's a little bit different to this one, more like a blue purple color that I use for a weaker reg. And what I do is I go over to that weaker reg and I would specifically have notes on a weaker reg. So they will have specific things that can be exploited, that they have quite big holes in their game. So if I see that tag, I might go, okay, I've got this guy tagged as a weaker regular. Let's hover over. Okay, great. This guy might have a really high fold to 3-bet, for example. This guy might 3-bet way too aggressively and then fold to 4-bet. This guy might c-bet 100% of range on all board textures and then give up a lot on turns. I would note that and mark that in the notes. I wouldn't just go weak reg, because that means fuck all, doesn't it? You could be weak for any number of reasons. I must know in real time why I've made that tag. If you want to, you can also date your notes. I mean, I don't think you have to with most of the time. But if you're playing really large volume and you're starting to go up in stakes, I would recommend potentially having timestamps like dates on your notes, so you can see how relevant that information may be. For example, 2 years ago, that guy was playing 5-5-1. However, 2 years ago, 2 years from now, he's actually now crushing, and he's now playing like, I don't know, 26, 24, 12. I don't know. Maybe he's really, really good all of a sudden. So you need to sort of be careful that your notes are up to date and relevant. You might also have a strong regular. So, for example, exactly the same as weak, but the other way around, is you might identify, I've actually got some tags here. So I've got loose aggressive as this red tag, but then as this orange tag, which is a separate color to anything else, I have this tag as a really strong reg. So someone who's shown me really, really more advanced or complicated or correct lines. He's overbetting flop on ace king 4. Usage button versus big blind, for example. Maybe he's 5-bet bluffing. Maybe he's 4-bet bluffing more often. Maybe he's got very, very good balanced 10% sizes. I don't know, just examples where your villain is showing you very, very strong aggressive lines that are not sort of silly. They're not over aggressive. They don't make any. It's not that they don't make sense. They're just good, strong, aggressive fundamental play. It's really important to mark them as stronger regs and again put notes on them and why, and then you can look at them. Your HUD information will give you most of that by default, but you might have pieces of information. You say, right, I know he's playing quite a lot of hands. I know he's aggressive overall. I've got a note here. Let's have a look. I've got him tagged as a strong reg. Let's have a look. Has 5-bet bluffs. Button versus small blind as an example. It's again you've already profiled the opponent, you've got your HUD information, but then on top of that, you've got specified notes. Like you're ticking all the boxes there that just make it easier to identify who you're playing against and how to try and play against them. Yes, you'll use a strategy that should theoretically play against everybody in a similar way like GTO, but generally in most stakes, you're going to be exploiting a lot of situations regardless. And it's really important to know if you've got a tough river decision and you're against an extremely loose aggressive player or a whaley player who may overbluff, you need to start looking at how you might start calling these guys down a bit more often. You're against absolutely nitty players. So that's the next one I've got, which is my light blue or cyan color here. When they're 3-betting you pre or 4-betting you pre or over-betting and jamming and going all in, you might want to be very careful what hands you call down with them compared to playing with someone like a mental case loose aggressive whale or a stronger aggressive opponent. If you're c-betting quite thin against a really strong opponent or a mental case, expect to get binned more often than if you're doing it against a nit or a recreational. If you're looking to get called quite wide, again, your recreational is going to be the guy that's going to be the guy to call you. If you're thinking you could potentially bluff your opponents, be careful against doing it like against, potential fish, weaker players who have tendencies to call down quite wide, or if you're doing it over bluffing potentially in a particular spot where you'll have a lot of bluffs, a strong regular might identify that and call you correctly as well. So be conscious about those types of color codes you use and use that information correctly. It's really good. So we've got the nit, the over-exaggerated type player. Again, I've given some more examples of stats here. Again, a nit is different to a tight regular. For example, I'd say a nit is, a 3-3-1 and a 10-7-3, really tight opponent, okay? Almost like you just kind of have to overfold almost every time. And then a strong regular, again, this varies, right? You can get strong regulars who play a bit tighter or a bit more aggressive. But like a 25-23-12, that's very, very aggressive. But again, like potential if you're against someone who's playing extremely, extremely well and looking to play more of a volatile and aggressive gameplay, which maybe they're going to be using to run over the lower to mid-stakes games, potentially. So what else we got here? Finally, heavy cooling station. I don't actually have my own station tag because you can be an aggressive opponent, a tight opponent, a nit, you can be a recreational and still be a heavy cooling station. It's just, I might use this as a note here where you can look at how often do they go to showdown, how often do they win on showdown, how often are they folding versus flops, turns and rivers. Again, you might have a note here and just say, look, guy called me down with a ridiculous hand, ridiculous spot. Mark the note of the type of hand and what he called with in the situation very, very briefly. And then you've got a piece of information for yourself next time you play against them when you're thinking about playing a thin spot. So, final thoughts. If you are new to profiling or taking notes on players, or just using HUD, relevant HUD stats just in general, very, very easy points to remember. Just keep it simple, guys. Like, just keep to the very, very basics. Very, very simple notes. Very simple colors, easy to see, easy to identify. Not very, not super detailed. Just small, specific pieces of information. Very basic color profiles and notes that focus on just a few words or abbreviated sentences. And then finally, opening, only using basic HUD options or pieces of information, such as the VPIP, so how many hands they're playing, their PFR, how many hands they're raising, how many hands they're re-raising they're 3-betting, and also folding to 3-bet percentage is quite important, and then just general flop c-bet, and then finally folding to a flop c-bet. You can obviously add and take away whatever you want, but these are the basic default sort of pieces of information for you. So as always, please like, please comment, please subscribe if you are not and you're enjoying the content. There is still sort of 45% of you at least or so that are watching these videos regularly and are not subscribed. So just get subscribed, just press the button. It makes a massive difference for me. Leave your comments as well. If there's things you want to see, if there's pieces of information you want, if there's questions to ask, throw them on the comment section and leave a like. It's very, very much appreciated. Also, as always, link below in the description with the GTO Wizard 10% off the first purchase. And also join the Discord and follow my Twitch. All the details are in the description. Thank you. And as always, we will see you in the next one.